Okay, so I see Suzanne and then Masako. Suzanne.
Hi. Well, thank you for two really interesting papers. And so I was wondering whether, how to put the two papers, in fact, in conversation with each other. And I thought maybe around the term televisuality. And so I guess for Vazira, I would ask about the footage that you were showing us throughout the talk, which is truly overwhelming. And I was wondering whether the term televisuality would help you here in your analysis, I mean, in the way that is being proposed by Lynne. And then I just have a second question for you, which is about, when is one a civilian? Or the way I was thinking about it is, when is a land deemed empty? Right? Because in an empty land, aerial bombing would be permitted, presumably, right? But what would constitute empty and what would constitute inhabited within the logic of this colonial discourse? And then for Lynne, the term televisuality is really interesting, and here's what I'm wondering. In terms of, at the end of your talk, you were inviting us to find ways in which we could use the term in sort of a critical manner. And so given, that televisuality in connection to Trump and, post-truths, et cetera, where this became so prevalent, do you think that the term or that televisuality could have, let's say, a theory of the lie, right? In other words, is there a way to make televisuality operable in such a way that it could expose lies as opposed to simply beyond this kind of continuing sort of proliferation of them?
Yes, interesting. Vazira, do you want to go first, or should I go first, or?
Go ahead.
Okay. One thing I would say to your first part about televisuality being a linkage between the two talks, I think that that's absolutely right, Suzanne. And I think that, that's in a way inscribed in the history of television itself. So again, television literally means, right? Television, seeing from a distance, seeing from afar. And television, as we have come to know it, right, was developed and financed by, right? Video technology could have gone multiple ways, as we see now in our use of it in Zoom. But it was basically developed and financed primarily from two sources, one of which was consumer commodity industries to become a home good. But another important one is precisely military technologies, where it was designed for exactly the reasons, horrific though they are, that Vazira talks about, for surveillance. And again, particularly for surveillance from afar, like aerial bombing, right? So again, I cited Raymond Williams, and one of the things Williams is so interested in is, again, how this, again, his book, Television, Technology and Cultural Form, how a technology, doesn't have its own inherent determinations, but becomes fit in and developed in particular ways to be a cultural form. And again, there's this way in which this development of TV is endless scanning, both as a kind of access to the world we get in entertainment, but again, as surveillance, right? So I think it's important to remember the militaristic and surveillant uses of televisuality as much as the consumer and commodification ones. And again, they're linked together through the way that a particular textual form and technology becomes designed to link with a kind of economy and politics. And surveillant TV now is, of course, used in warfare. And then that itself is made pleasurable in certain TV genres that are, you know, whether it's reality shows that simulate warfare, or whether it's things like cops that literally are using surveillance technologies and turning them into a mode of entertainment, you know, to the effect of now when people watch aerial footage or other surveillance in wars, it can seem like a game to people, right? Again, to the point, to go to other things I said, where QAnon now, for example, thinks it is nothing but a game. They think it's just a, you know, sort of construction by the global elites to trick us so that we don't realize that we're being injected with, you know, vaccines that have chips or something, so that they see the whole thing is. So I do think that there's that linkage that is important to note. So I think that that's a good point, Suzanne. In answer to your other question about could televisuality have a theory of the lie, that's and expose lies. Again, that's very interesting question. In a way, I think what was arguing is that what I was trying to argue was that there's a way in which televisual logics sort of blur, they both articulate and blur these categories through their very operations of flow, so that there is not anymore sort of a big, you know, it's not a binary, if it ever was, right, between real and fake news. I mean, news of any kind, any representation, of course, is always structured. It's never just neutral. But there's a way in which those are, again, the logics make those non-opposition. So what I was trying to argue is that televisual logic sort of shift the ways we usually think. So does that mean that there could never be a way to actually expose lies because it's always blurring them? I mean, right now with media bubbles, you know, what Fox News considers a lie and what, you know, CNN considers a lie are totally different now, because we're in this, you know, again, segmented world where knowledge itself, like I said, is like a brand now. What's known or not known, or thinkable or unthinkable, or seen as real or not real, you know, is branded in a way that now you have a fight between those. Now, in a way, the very fight between those can give rise to certain things. So, you know, I do think it's important for people to engage with the televisual and to enter into that and not, you know, just throw up our hands and saying, oh, now we have no categories. No, we do, but they're different ones, and we have to figure out how to sort of engage with them. I hope that vaguely answers the question. But Vazira, I'd love to hear your own thoughts.
Thank you. No, I think the televisuality question you answered better than I could have, thinking with seeing at a distance. But I also would just wanted to add to that we are all on like as you said, this segmented screen, and to see this film from the archive on your screen as if it is television, this relationship between the film and the televisual aspect of it was, I think, intensified. The mediation through the screens to watch it through the screens of our computers, and I worried about that. So it's closer than I like to see it myself. The film. And to briefly just respond to empty and inhabited, I mean, this is the foundational violence of colonialism. It's a foundational violence that gets enacted again and again and again in different places, and for different purposes. So I'll leave it.
Okay, I've got Masako, then Jinying, and then Adi. Masako.
Thank you so much, Vazira and Lynn. And both talks were very interesting and fascinating. And I agree with Suzanne about the importance of the concept of television. And so I'm thinking, do I understand correctly? I'm kind of like talking to myself in a way. Television, in a way, it's a view from far. You don't get to see the details. You don't get to see everything. You can actually selectively show certain features. You can actually pick. And so these selected features can be kind of emphasized, and you can build on associations based on the selected features, and you can kind of create snowball effects relating to a certain ideology. So, for example, even if you have a sort of like a surveillance camera or aerial view, and you are actually surveillancing, but this means that there is some sort of probably intention to show something like in Iraq, or say that this area is inhabited or empty, and kind of give the reason why you can attack or not attack. And you can also sort of show selective aspects of activism. They can kind of, these features, selected features, can actually work in a sort of positive way. But I was wondering, I guess I'm interested in disinformation in particular. So I was wondering if this kind of model, if this selectivity that I think that the pattern of selection might actually sort of lead to exposing sort of how lies are constructed, like how the features are selected, and that would lead to like construction of lies. So I was wondering, do I make sense? I just, I thought that I would ask that question.
Yeah, I think that totally makes sense. I think that is exactly in a way what I was, that again, there's a way I would argue in with this notion of flow, which I think operates now in a world where, we are constantly engaging the world through these streams and flows of, video mediated material, televisual material. In a way, it seems to produce a kind of totalization, right? But yet, that notion is it's flow and segmentation. It's continuity defined by discontinuity. So you're right. It's also, these separate kind of segments, these separate kind of bits, and absolute. I mean, what you're describing, in fact, it's exactly what I try to do in my television studies courses, which is to get the students to think about, well, how exactly within that are things put together? What particular bits are taken out and put together in what way to construct a sense of the total that actually is made up of all these partial views. And if you try to step back and analyze, well, what exactly are those, then you see the sort of ideologies encoded into that. So I think that's exactly correct.
Thank you.
Jinying.
Thank you for the fascinating talk, both are very powerful with two very, very intriguing concepts. My specific question is for Lynne, because while I'm listening to your talk, I think about several related concepts: unthinkable, unbelievable, unimaginable. And interesting, the way you talk about unthinkable seems to be bypassing the distinction among those different concepts, because you talk about lies and not lies, fiction, reality, and the imaginary. So I read these three concepts to thinking about relation, or the lack of relation, or lack of distinction right now. It's particular because your way of by composing those differences seem to rely on Raymond Williams' very intriguing concept of flow, which he argued that television flow indeed oversee the textual and epidemiological differences, like image and text and sound, so on and so forth. And the way he conceptualizing this flow as overseeing the distinction, the differences, which you read as epidemiological crisis, seem to echo how Fidler read the digital media. That is, digital media often using the concept streaming, similar to flow. That for Fidler, the digital media seem to oversee the difference between text, image, and the sound, which he previously divided between francophone, gramophone, typewriter, and cinema. And he sees digital media converging them all. But what's for Fidler is interesting, it's different from Raymond Williams. He also using Lacanian distinction between the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. To say the three distinctions that Lacan divided no longer matters, because they're all converging in the digital streaming. So I wonder if the television flow before digital media already predict this integration between the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, that Fidler argues that no longer matters, the difference, no longer distinguishable, and whether that kind of lack of distinction between the imaginary, the real, and the symbolic was indeed playing into this concept, unthinkable, which seemed to be, again, indistinguishable from unbelievable and unimaginable. So my question is, I'm asking, what are you thinking about the relationship or the lack of distinction between thinkable, imaginable, and believable, and how the very maybe lack of distinction may make you thinking about the televisual versus the digital, televisual flow versus the digital streaming? Thank you.
Yeah. I think that is such a fascinating question, or sort of multiple questions together, which I don't think I can fully do justice to, but I will try. I think for one, I would just say that again, I always, now of course this is because I'm a television studies scholar, but I always think that, television, I always want to make the point that is still our dominant cultural medium. So I think that we live in an era where people are like, oh, we're post-television, no one watches TV anymore, which to me is, even when I teach in my TV studies classes and the students are like, nobody watches TV anymore. And yet they know every single television program that I mentioned from like the 1950s through, so I think there's a way in which people don't think of things as televisual precisely now because everything is televisual. It's the air we breathe. It's like the way we access the world through flows of screened and scanned material, including even this Zoom meeting where we look like we're, in the boxes on Hollywood Squares or the Brady Bunch, and we're used to engaging through scanning of streams. So I feel like there's a way in which the internet itself, right, and digital media, again, with all media forms, it's not an inherent technological potential, it's how they're developed. And they were always already developed and partially financed on the model of television, financed by the same corporations that owned TV stations, to already be organized as sort of streams of material that could be monetized, right? That could, through the interruptibility of streaming. So there's a way in which, for me, I don't want to just equate them, but I think streaming already, was built on a kind of televisual model, so that in digital convergence culture, that most people emphasize the digital. I always want to emphasize, no, this is also televisual, right? And that very way. So I don't want to equate them, but I think they're related. In terms of your question about, so Fidler arguing about the imaginary, symbolic, and real distinctions no longer matter, I do think that's incredibly interesting to think about with TV. I think what I was trying to argue is there's, again, a funny way in which this logic, the televisual logic I'm describing, the mediatized logic, is based on a curious way that I feel like we don't even really have the language to describe, where there are both distinctions articulated and blurred at the exact same time. So I would say it's not that the distinctions no longer matter, they do, right? And at the same time, they matter partly because they're undone. It's always both that, flow and segmentation, difference and totality, that mixture. And they can also operate as alibis for one another, right? In terms of how things are. So I think that we can't say that those are not distinctions, and especially for thinking about the audience phantasmatics, the way it's, we have to think about it, but the way that they, intersect and interact, and both, are form, each kind of network, whether it's, literally a network like Fox News, wants to argue that its version of the real is real and other people's version of the real is imaginary, right? So that they're using those categories even as they undermine them. In my own use of the categories, I think that's interesting what you called attention to, the move in a way. Maybe myself, I'm doing the same thing, both distinguishing but blurring the difference between unbelievable, unimaginable, and unthinkable. So that's very interesting. I think it's more common when people talk about media forms, whatever they might be, from photography, film, to television, to talk about imaginable or believable, right? The willing suspension of disbelief, or the way it gets our imaginary. I think those are more common. So in a way, I wanted to stress the thinkable or unthinkable, to kind of make the argument that these are, in fact, logics through which we are thinking, even if we are not aware of them, especially because we're not aware of them, that they're producing what we can either think or not think, right? And that even in a medium like television, seen, like I said, typically as the most thoughtless, the most inhibiting of thought, right? And just sort of, stupid. I'm saying, no, it is giving us a mode of thinking that in fact is our world now. So we have to purposely engage in it in order to think about how we want to think about things and how we can use that logic to bring our own unthinkable visions from afar into actuality. So that's why I wanted to stress the unthinkable as opposed to using, which I guess you're right, I could have also used as my terms unbelievable or unimaginable. But again, I kind of wanted to try to emphasize the logics behind it. But again, thank you for that question.
Okay, I've got Adi, then Tim, and then Nils.
Thank you for great papers. I would like to say a word about the thinkable, the unthinkable, the unbelievable. The unbelievable appear in Vazira's talk several times, and it's certainly not the unthinkable of Lynne or of the televisual logic. And I wonder if you can say something about this distinction. My hunch is that the unthinkable, and just correct me if I'm wrong, the unthinkable in Lynne's talk is just a quality of something we think about. Of course, we think about it. We think about the fact that Trump may or is a president, may become or is a president, and we call this idea unthinkable.
Right.
The unbelievable in the context of aerial bombing is something, of course, you believe that it has occurred, but there is something unbelievable about what brought it about, or something like this. I'm not sure, but I wonder how you would compare these two negations. But my question is to Vazira. I would like to invite you to think about the distinction about the concept of the civilian in relation to the concept of the citizen. The concept of the civilian as part of an opposition, of course, the civilian vis-a-vis the combatant. But actually, in your talk, the civilian is not simply the other of the combatant. The civilian is the mark, the distinction itself is the mark of sovereignty. The sovereign is the one who has the right to distinguish between the civilian and the combatant, and to impose this distinction. So I think there is a parallel here, and I wonder if you can develop it or think with it, because the citizen is not simply part of the opposition between a citizen and a non-citizen, like us and them, or something like this. The citizen, to paraphrase Balibar, is the one who comes after the subject. The subject, in the sense of subject to the king or subject to the prince, or the citizen as the equal human being governed with other equal human beings, etc. So we have here at the background, we have both, in both cases, we have sovereigns in the background, and concept of sovereignty at the background. So I wonder if you can take this farther.
Thank you very much. I think it might also connect to the short answer that I gave to Suzanne's question. Actually, it was inadequate, an inadequate one, in that it was an invitation to think about what would habitation look like. And And I think that's connected to the question of belief and disbelief that I put in, because particularly the photographer, it was a quote from the photographer who said he could not believe that the Pathan, the unarmed Pathan, existed. He could not believe that there were people who could be conceived of as part of worlds where this question of being combatant and non-combatant, or being armed or unarmed, was one that had been made so significant in the production of the savage insurrection, that the disbelief was around the fact that there could be forms of habitation that were not tied to militant resistance to the colonial state. And so what does habitation look like when it has to be erased continuously in order to produce the scenes of militancy in which bombing villages makes total sense and has widespread support for. So yeah, this question of unbelievable is also, the word unbelievable also struck me. And when Jinying was speaking, I actually wrote down unbelievable as like the word that connected us thinking about what is the status of disbelief? What is it that we are believing and disbelieving? And why is that the case? There can be so much support for this kind of violence only because of some kind of suspension of disbelief in viewing the scenes or understanding the scenes of resistance. In selecting the civilian and the question of sovereignty, it's a really provocative. I mean, I thank you so much for that. It's really making me think that I haven't thought that far ahead of how civilian, although civilian and citizen was something that in relation to citizen, how does one think with the category civilian, and what does it mean to place a civilian or recuperate the civilian or rescue the civilian as part of an anti-colonial struggle, which is seeking sovereignty. And so, so sovereignty is at the heart of, and if you have sovereignty to be civilian, to resist, to dissent, and be civilian at the same time. I will have to think more about it, but it's really important, I think, parallel civilian and citizen, to think about how the civilian comes after the subject, because as a subject, I mean, even to be a subject, striving to become civilian, to have to become civilian before you can become citizen, in a way. Is civilian merely a stepping stone for becoming a citizen, or do we think of civilian as in of itself that which, regardless of whether you are or not citizen, something that you can hold with sovereignty?
I want to give Lynn a quick chance to respond to the question that Adi raised about the difference between unthinkable and unbelievable, if you'd like to, Lynn.
Yeah, just
to
some
you.
very quick responses. Again, thank you so much, Adi. I think that your point about, in a way, we're using Unthinkable differently, and that what is a great point, because you're right. I was, in a way, showing how these things marked as unthinkable, if anything, just invite more thinking, right? Like, and as I said about conspiracy, you know, the more unthinkable it is, the more it does that. So I do think that that's very different. And I think that Vazira, you know, analysis, having to, you know, reading this through a decolonial perspective is exactly what one needs to do to be able to get at that distinction. The other quick thing I would say, and just in terms of citizen, from, you know, thinking again about the way we think through television, the way television defines citizen in a way, right? If we think of programs, I mean, now I'm going to reference a famous argument by Jane Fuhrer. If we think of programs like exemplary, something like Good Morning America, that speaks to us as America, right? It goes out from a central place and speaks to everybody, you know, as part of America, as part of this flow where you get the national, but then it will cut into your own locality. Here's the weather, your neck of the woods, right? But it constructs this way in which you're part of America as a television viewer, right? So that television asserts citizen equals public equals audience equals commodified position, right? It equates all of those so that citizenship it becomes, through a kind of televisual dominant mode, nothing but being a commodified member of an audience, right? And now segmented market. So again, what I'm suggesting is we need to think about how it does that and try to redefine that ourselves. But it's only by thinking about that we can partially see how we have gotten in to these, you know, incredibly troubling political logics now.
So Tim and then Nils.
Yeah, yes, thank you very much. Again, I found it impossible to think about these really extraordinary papers separately from each other. And I suppose the term that I am thinking around both papers is the televisual, as has already been remarked. Lynne, your playing with the word television took me back to Zachary Singh's paper, where he made a similar play between the word tell and the word count, and you know, he was also kind of interested in modes that do not fall into the regime of counting. And I was interested, I mean, both of you seem to me to be talking about a certain kind of regime. For you, Lynne, it's the regime of the televisual. In other words, a sort of whole conceptual apparatus that determines the way that we're understanding culture and the possibility of thought in our moment. And obviously for Vazira, the regime in question is colonialism, and the degree to which the category of the civilian acts as a kind of authorizing concept for aerial bombing. I mean, that's how I was kind of hearing you. That we need the concept of the civilian, and in particular the kind of the lack of civilian casualties in order to authorize, you know, aerial bombing. And I wanted to ask you both, what for you is the sort of exception or the escape from the regimes that you're both interested in? Lynne, you were very careful in this one of the most interesting moments of your paper, where you were constructing the logic of televisuality as also incorporating certain recent critical modes like critical fabulation and affect and the vibrant matter are all part of a kind of televisual logic to current critical practice. I mean, this I found completely fascinating, and particularly the fact that you were reluctant, or in fact you refused to say that we should not be, we are locked into this logic. It's not that these are bad, these are part of our mediatized culture. In other words, we are in a sense condemned to this televisual regime, not necessarily condemned, but we are forced to think within it. And these are creative modes within which we think and think alongside and think the very condition of televisuality within which we are constrained, or our thinking is constrained and determined. So you're very careful not to sort of posit any kind of logic of exception. And I'm wondering if I'm hearing you correctly, and if the televisual logic is if the word regime is correct for talking about that logic, because the word regime seems to indicate the possibility of not thinking within it or thinking about outside it. And I suppose I have, it's a bit forced, but I want to ask Vazira also, the civilian as alibi, the civilian as the alibi for aerial bombing. And this devastating question that you ask, can a non-European be a civilian? If so, under what conditions? And I didn't hear an answer to that question, what the conditions might be for a non-European to be a civilian. And I wonder if you could narrate to us your provisional tentative answer to that question.
Again, I can jump in. Thank you so much, Tim. That is really interesting, and I want to think about more. I think that you're probably right that I don't see an escape from it. I think that I see this as, the logics through which we're now thinking. And like I said, that even resistant or oppositional things are in some ways thinking through comparable logic. So I guess I do think that, but by saying that, I don't want to make it sound like this is all horror. I mean, much as I think it's obviously incredibly critical to be critical of TV, I also, of course, love TV. So I think that there are ways in which, precisely because the logics that I was trying to map are more contradictory than they seem, more paradoxical, I think within them there are ways to play with and twist and do different things. So I think that, right, I think I'm saying there is not just a binary opposition where we can get outside of this, but that doesn't mean that we cannot do things within it. And in fact, it's a sphere in which we need to engage, right? So I think that the way you just describe what I think is probably what I think. So thank you for that.
Great.
Thank you. Thinking with regime, there's Ariella uses the term archival regime, and one can think with that here as well. The ways in which, in her case, she argues the violence precedes the formation of the archive itself, but then it's continuing. I mean, it's part of reproducing a certain kind of violence. And I wanted to think with that, because the one thing I have seen in the years I've been working on this region is that the colonial records are just reproduced and reproduced and reproduced continuously. Almost all the British records, this film is online, masses and masses of official documents are available, downloadable, and we know that the U.S. military, mimetic fashion has turned to and studied with and would read and think with the reproduction of the archive is not accidental, is very much in time with military engagements in the region. So there is the reproduction of this violence. And so somehow to intervene and go back and think with the colonial archive differently, and disrupt it somehow seems integral to, if we are to also make room for and disrupt the ways in which narratives are built upon it, that they're unauthorized through that past, right? That this is what worked for the British, we will do it again. So as to disrupt that kind of understanding and to be able to offer or think with other histories and render them believable. in some way. Can the non-European be a civilian? If I haven't offered that, offered some answer to that question, then I fear I failed, because indeed the non-European has had to be restituted through anti-colonial thought and mobilization. It was to gesture to the ways in which over these last 2 decades, we have seen so much of a different kind of, well, one with the drones, like aerial bombing, new technology, an attention to an anxiety around what it is, the ways in which the civilian disappears. So attempts to give a count of, and a lot of effort and attention on counting civilians has, of course, also required, as we can see with any number of, if you go to any number of sites and organizations that have been attempting to give a count of civilians, has, of course, not been able to give a count because it requires all this other epistemic work in order to be able to say, here, there was a civilian. Right, so it is all of that work, and there is there continues to be both the juridical exercise of arguing for recent texts by Adil Haq, for instance, takes on the revisionist legal theorists, which had actually eviscerated the possibility of a civilian in a whole array of not just conflict zones, but sites of resistance. Through juridical means, and then, of course, getting on the ground and giving an account of the many, many different ways of giving an account of people's lives, and to an account of habitation. So I think so the answer is, when can the non-European be a civilian? When we struggle to. It necessarily requires struggle.
Thank you, Vazira. Thank you both.
Please join me in thanking Vazira and Lynne for a couple of very terrific papers.